Hello, dear listeners. Welcome to the English Globe, a place where we explore global issues and practice English together. Today, we are very happy to have you with us, and we promise that this episode will give you both knowledge and useful English learning practice. Remember, our goal here is to make complicated world topics easy to understand, so you can learn English step by step while also learning about the world we live in.
Yes, and today we have chosen a very special and important topic. We are going to discuss the relationship between the United States and Turkey, two countries that are both part of NATO, but sometimes seem to have very different interests. The title of our episode is US and Turkey, NATO allies or strategic rivals. This is a big question in international politics, and it is also a good chance for you to learn new vocabulary and improve your listening skills.
Now, why is this topic important? First, because both the United States and Turkey play big roles in world politics. The United States is one of the most powerful members of NATO, and Turkey is also a key member because of its geography, its military, and its role as a bridge between Europe and Asia. When these two countries agree, NATO is stronger. But when they disagree, NATO can face serious challenges.
Exactly, and another reason this is important is because it helps us understand how alliances in international relations work. Sometimes countries are official allies, meaning they promise to help each other, but in practice they may have disagreements, conflicts, or different goals. This shows us that international politics is not black and white, but full of grey areas where cooperation and rivalry can exist at the same time.
And for our English learners, this topic is also very useful. You will hear words like allies, rivals, strategy, defense, diplomacy, and security. These are important terms in global discussions, and learning them will help you not only in your English journey, but also in understanding international news, books, and conversations about world affairs.
Dear listeners, before we go deeper into this discussion, we kindly ask for your support. If you are enjoying this podcast, please click the like button, subscribe to the English Globe channel, and also share this video with friends who want to learn English. Your support helps us continue creating long and useful content for you.
And we would also love to hear your opinions. After you listen to today's podcast, tell us in the comments what you think. Do you see the United States and Turkey more as allies working together, or as rivals competing with each other? Your answers will make this discussion richer, and we will be happy to read your thoughts.
Yes, please share your ideas. Even simple sentences are welcome because this is a learning space. If you write in English, you are practicing, and practice is the best way to improve. We read every comment, and we really enjoy seeing your progress. Remember, this channel is not just about listening. It is about learning and participating.
So today's journey will take us back in history and also into the present. We will look at Turkey's entry into NATO in the 1950s, its strategic role during the Cold War, and its cooperation with the United States. Then we will move step by step through times of cooperation, times of tension, and the issues that continue to shape this relationship today, like the Kurdish question, the S-400 missile defense system, and economic ties.
At the end of this podcast, we will also reflect on what English learners can gain from studying topics like this. We want you to leave with new knowledge, new vocabulary, and new confidence in your listening and speaking skills. So stay with us until the end, because we have a lot to share with you today.
Once again, welcome to the English Globe. We are very excited to begin. Let us now start by exploring Turkey's entry into NATO and the early years of US-Turkey cooperation, which will give us the foundation to understand how this relationship has changed over time. Let us now begin with Turkey's entry into NATO, because this is where the story of US-Turkey cooperation really starts. The year was 1952, only 3 years after NATO was created. At that time, the Cold War was beginning to divide the world into two major camps, one led by the United States and its Western allies, and the other led by the Soviet Union. Turkey found itself in a very sensitive position, sharing a long border with the Soviet Union and controlling access to the Black Sea through the Bosporus and Dardanelles Straits.
This geography gave Turkey a unique importance in the Cold War. The United States and its allies believed that if Turkey joined NATO, it would strengthen the southern flank of the alliance. It would help secure Europe from the east and also provide a key bridge between Europe and the Middle East. In those years, the US was deeply worried about Soviet expansion, and Turkey was seen as a frontline state capable of helping NATO contain the Soviet Union.
Yes, and we should remember that Turkey itself also wanted security. After the Second World War, the Soviet Union pressured Turkey over the control of the straits and even made demands for bases and territorial adjustments. This created fear in Ankara, and Turkish leaders believed that joining NATO would give the country protection through Article 5, which says that an attack on one member is an attack on all. For Turkey, this was a guarantee that the US and other allies would stand by it in case of Soviet aggression.
So, when Turkey entered NATO in 1952, it was a moment of both strategic logic and political symbolism. For the United States, it meant that NATO had a strong and loyal member on the southeastern flank, close to the Soviet Union, the Middle East, and the Mediterranean. For Turkey, it meant recognition as an important member of the Western Alliance and a promise of protection and partnership. This was the foundation of US-Turkey relations during the Cold War.
Now, let us look at the military benefits. One of the most important aspects of Turkey's entry was the use of its territory for NATO bases and facilities. The US established air bases, radar stations, and listening posts in Turkey, with Incirlik Air Base becoming one of the most significant. From there, American aircraft could operate across the region, and intelligence could be gathered on Soviet movements. This made Turkey not just a member, but a vital asset for the alliance.
Turkey also contributed strongly to NATO's military capacity. Turkish soldiers fought in the Korean War alongside US troops even before joining NATO, and their performance impressed Western leaders. This showed that Turkey was ready to take on responsibilities as an ally, not just to receive protection. Over the years, Turkey became one of NATO's largest contributors of manpower, with a strong army positioned in a critical region. This was a demonstration of both loyalty and strategic usefulness.
Politically, Turkey's membership also brought benefits to the West. It connected NATO more directly with the Middle East and helped project Western influence in a region where the Soviet Union was also trying to expand. In the 1950s and 1960s, this political alignment made NATO stronger and gave Turkey a seat at the table of Western decision-making. For the US, this meant that Turkey could be both a partner in Europe and a channel to the Middle East.
But of course, every relationship has challenges, and the US-Turkey alliance was no different. In the 1960s, there were moments of tension, especially over Cyprus. Turkey's involvement on the island and conflicts with Greece, another NATO member, created difficulties inside the alliance. The US often found itself trying to balance support for both Greece and Turkey, which was not an easy task. Still, despite these problems, the larger picture remained one of cooperation and mutual need.
One example of strong cooperation was during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. The world was focused on Soviet missiles in Cuba, but in fact, the US also had nuclear missiles stationed in Turkey, which the Soviets saw as a direct threat. The presence of these missiles in Turkey showed how important the country was in the US defense strategy. Later, when the crisis was resolved, the US agreed to remove those missiles from Turkey, but their presence demonstrated how central Turkey had become to the balance of power.
In the 1970s, however, the relationship faced new tests. One of the biggest crises came after Turkey's military intervention in Cyprus in 1974. The US Congress responded by imposing an arms embargo on Turkey, which created deep anger in Ankara. For a few years, relations were very cold, and Turkey even limited US access to some of its bases. But even during this time of mistrust, both sides recognized that they needed each other, and eventually the embargo was lifted, showing again that strategic necessity was stronger than political disputes.
When we look at the period from the 1950s to the 1970s, the main theme is that of cooperation with challenges. The U.S. supported Turkey's modernization of its military, provided economic aid through programs like the Marshall Plan, and worked closely with Turkey in NATO exercises and missions. In return, Turkey gave NATO valuable geographic access and a strong fighting force. Despite moments of disagreement, both sides found reasons to stay committed to the alliance.
For English learners, this part of history is important because it shows us how words like alliance, strategy, cooperation, and rivalry are not just abstract terms. They have real meaning in international politics. When you hear about Turkey joining NATO, you can think about what an ally means, what a strategic partner is, and why cooperation is sometimes stronger than disagreements. These are useful concepts for both language and global understanding.
So in summary, Turkey's entry into NATO in 1952 was not just a small event, it was a major shift in the Cold War, making NATO stronger and giving Turkey a place in the Western alliance. For the United States, it was about securing the southern flank and gaining bases close to the Soviet Union. For Turkey, it was about security, recognition, and partnership. The cooperation of these years created a foundation that continues to influence U.S.-Turkey relations even today.
And with this background in mind, we can now move forward to look at how the relationship developed in later decades. After the early cooperation of the 1950s to 1970s, the end of the Cold War brought new challenges and opportunities, and the US and Turkey had to redefine their roles in a changing world. But before we explore that, let us pause and reflect on what we have learned so far about the importance of alliances, geography, and cooperation in international relations.
As we move forward in our discussion, let us focus on the military cooperation between the United States and Turkey, because this is where the alliance becomes very clear. During the Cold War, Turkey was often described as a frontline state. This meant that it was positioned directly on the edge of the NATO world, right next to the Soviet Union. Few other NATO members had such a direct and dangerous neighbor, and this gave Turkey an important responsibility inside the alliance.
That is true. Geography made Turkey extremely valuable to the United States and to NATO as a whole. The country sits at the crossroads of Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. It controls the Bosporus and Dardanelles Straits, which connect the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. This means that any movement of Soviet ships from the Black Sea had to pass near Turkish waters. In addition, Turkey's southern position gave NATO direct access to the Middle East, a region of constant strategic concern.
Because of this geography, the United States quickly developed military facilities in Turkey after it joined NATO. One of the most famous is the Incirlik Air Base, established in the 1950s. Incirlik became a hub for American air power in the region, allowing the U.S. to monitor Soviet activity, support NATO missions, and later launch operations in the Middle East. It was not just a base, it was a symbol of U.S.-Turkey cooperation and the trust that existed between the two allies.
Incirlik was important not only for intelligence and surveillance, but also for nuclear strategy. During the Cold War, the United States stationed nuclear weapons in Turkey as part of NATO's defense plan. This was highly sensitive, but it showed that Washington trusted Ankara to host such weapons and believed Turkey was critical for the balance of power. For the Soviets, this was a direct challenge, but for NATO, it was a reassurance that the alliance could respond to threats quickly from the southern flank.
Of course, military cooperation was not just about bases. Turkey itself became one of NATO's strongest military contributors. With a large standing army, well-trained troops, and experience from conflicts such as the Korean War, Turkey quickly established itself as a serious partner. Turkish forces took part in NATO exercises, joint defense planning, and later peacekeeping missions, always demonstrating readiness to defend the alliance. This commitment gave Turkey credibility as not only a host, but also an active defender.
We should also remember that Turkey's army was not small. In fact, during the Cold War, it was one of the largest in NATO after the United States. Having such a strong force on the southeastern flank gave the alliance confidence that the region could be defended against Soviet advances. NATO strategy always considered Turkey as the shield that would protect southern Europe and provide a barrier to Soviet expansion. This role was not symbolic. It was central to the defense of the alliance.
Another important point is how Turkey used its position to shape regional security. Because it stood at the border of both Europe and the Middle East, Turkey often acted as a bridge. For example, it helped NATO monitor developments in the Middle East, whether during conflicts like the Arab-Israeli wars or during energy crises that affected the entire West. In this way, Turkey was not only guarding against the Soviet Union, but also supporting the alliance in its wider security interests.
The partnership between the US and Turkey was also reinforced by NATO's Article 5, which is the heart of the alliance. Article 5 says that if one NATO member is attacked, all members will treat it as an attack on themselves. For Turkey, this was an assurance that it would not face the Soviet Union alone. For the United States, it meant that Turkey was part of the collective defense system, ready to respond if NATO was attacked. This mutual commitment created a deep bond of trust.
And we saw the importance of Article 5 in practice many times. Even though the Cold War never led to direct conflict between NATO and the Soviet Union, the presence of that mutual defense guarantee gave both Turkey and the United States confidence in each other. It discouraged aggression and gave NATO members the security needed to plan long-term strategies. For Turkey, Article 5 was like a shield, and for the US, it meant having a reliable partner standing at the edge of the Soviet sphere.
Some people might wonder if this cooperation was always smooth. The answer is no. There were difficulties, especially when US policies in the Middle East clashed with Turkey's concerns. However, the military framework of the alliance remained strong because both sides knew that the risks of the Cold War required unity. Even when political disagreements arose, military cooperation continued, bases remained open, and joint planning was not abandoned. This shows how strong strategic necessity can be.
For English learners, this is a good place to practice key words like frontline, base, strategy, alliance, and deterrence. Each of these words carries meaning that is not only military, but also political. For example, the word frontline can describe both a battlefield and a position of responsibility. The word alliance means countries working together for a common goal. Learning these terms through real historical examples makes the vocabulary easier to remember and use in conversation.
If we look back at this period, we see that military cooperation was the glue that held the US-Turkey relationship together. Turkey's geography gave NATO a critical advantage. Incirlik Air Base became a pillar of US power projection. Turkish soldiers strengthened the alliance's manpower, and Article 5 provided the security guarantee that made both sides trust each other. Despite the challenges, the importance of this cooperation cannot be overstated. It was essential for the survival and strength of NATO during the Cold War.
And so, when we think of Turkey's role, we must understand that it was not just another member of NATO. It was the gatekeeper of the southern flank, the country that connected Europe and the Middle East, and the partner that allowed the United States to project power in ways that would not have been possible otherwise. Without Turkey, NATO would have been weaker, and US strategy in the Cold War would have faced many more difficulties.
This is why, even today, when we talk about whether the United States and Turkey are allies or rivals, the history of military cooperation always comes back into the discussion. It reminds us that no matter how many disagreements occur, the strategic logic of geography and defense creates powerful reasons for partnership. The Cold War may be over, but the lessons from that time still influence decisions made in Washington and Ankara.
When the Cold War ended in 1991, the world entered a completely new chapter, and so did the relationship between the United States and Turkey. For decades, Turkey's importance was defined mainly by its role as a frontline state against the Soviet Union. But once the Soviet Union collapsed, that enemy disappeared, and NATO had to redefine its purpose. For Turkey, this meant finding a new role inside the alliance, and for the United States, it meant deciding how to use Turkey's position in a very different security environment.
Yes, the 1990s were a period of uncertainty, but also opportunity. On one hand, there was no longer the same existential threat that had united the alliance. On the other hand, new regional challenges appeared. The Middle East became a central focus of US foreign policy, with conflicts in Iraq, tensions over oil security, and later the rise of terrorism. Because of its geography, Turkey was still deeply relevant. It sat right next to Iraq, Syria, and Iran, all countries that shaped Washington's strategies.
One of the first major tests of the post-Cold War relationship came during the Gulf War in 1991. When Iraq invaded Kuwait, the United States led a coalition to expel Iraqi forces. Turkey supported the U.S. effort, closing an oil pipeline from Iraq and allowing coalition forces to use its territory for operations. This cooperation showed that even though the Cold War was over, the alliance between Washington and Ankara could still be strong when their interests matched.
However, the Gulf War also created problems for Turkey. The collapse of Iraqi authority in the north allowed Kurdish groups to gain more autonomy, which Ankara feared would encourage separatism among its own Kurdish population. This issue of the Kurds would become one of the deepest points of tension between the US and Turkey in the following decades. So, while they worked together during the war, the long-term consequences created mistrust and suspicion in Ankara about US policies.
The 1990s also saw Turkey seeking a new identity. It wanted to strengthen ties with Europe and even hoped to join the European Union. At the same time, it explored relations with Central Asia and the Caucasus, regions that were once under Soviet control. For the United States, Turkey was useful in all these areas, acting as a bridge to the newly independent states. But the U.S. focus on the Middle East often clashed with Turkey's desire to expand its influence in other directions.
The next big turning point came after the attacks of September 11, 2001. The US declared a global war on terror and launched military operations in Afghanistan. Turkey, as a NATO member, quickly offered support. Turkish troops served in Afghanistan, not in direct combat, but in peacekeeping, training, and stabilization missions. This was important because it showed that Turkey was committed to helping the alliance in a new kind of war, even when the enemy was not a superpower like the Soviet Union, but a non-state group like Al-Qaeda.
That cooperation in Afghanistan was one of the bright spots in the post-Cold War relationship. However, at the same time, the U.S. decision to invade Iraq in 2003 created a major crisis. The Turkish parliament refused to allow American troops to launch the invasion from Turkish territory. This shocked Washington, which had expected full support from a NATO ally. It marked one of the lowest points in U.S.-Turkey relations, showing that the alliance was no longer as automatic as it had been during the Cold War.
The disagreement over Iraq highlighted how different their priorities had become. The US saw Iraq as a threat that needed to be removed, but Turkey worried about the consequences for regional stability and especially about Kurdish autonomy. For Ankara, the risk of an independent Kurdish state in northern Iraq was unacceptable. So while Washington focused on weapons of mass destruction and regime change, Ankara focused on borders, minorities, and security threats at home.
This was the new reality after 1991. The alliance was still there, but it was more complicated. Sometimes the U.S. and Turkey worked closely together, as in Afghanistan. Other times they disagreed sharply, as in Iraq. This balance between alignment and disagreement became the defining feature of their post-Cold War relationship. Unlike the Cold War, where the Soviet threat forced unity, the new era was full of separate calculations and different visions of security.
And this pattern continues even today. The Cold War gave the alliance a clear enemy, but after 1991, cooperation depended more on specific issues. On terrorism, the US and Turkey found common ground. On Iraq and Kurdish groups, they disagreed. On Afghanistan, they worked together. On broader Middle Eastern policies, they often had tension. This mix of cooperation and rivalry shows how alliances must adapt when the world changes.
For English learners, this part of history is useful because it teaches us words like intervention, autonomy, coalition, stability, and disagreement. Each of these words helps us describe the complex nature of international relations. You can see how cooperation is not always permanent, and how disagreements do not always mean the end of an alliance. The US and Turkey are a good example of how countries can both support and challenge each other at the same time.
So, the post-Cold War era was a turning point. The Soviet Union was gone, the global order was shifting, and the US-Turkey alliance had to find new reasons to stay strong. Sometimes those reasons were clear, as in Afghanistan. Other times the differences were too large, as in Iraq. But through it all, the relationship remained important, not only for the two countries, but also for NATO and the balance of security in Europe and the Middle East.
Dear listeners, now we arrive at a very important part of our discussion. Until now, we have seen that the United States and Turkey were close military allies, especially during the Cold War and in the years that followed. But when we look carefully at the political and diplomatic side of their relationship, we find many points of tension. These disagreements are not only about military issues, but also about values, policies, and the future direction of both countries. This makes the US-Turkey partnership complex and sometimes even fragile.
One of the first sources of disagreement has often been the topic of human rights and democracy. The United States regularly places a strong emphasis on democratic institutions, freedom of speech, and the rule of law. At times, American leaders and officials have criticized Turkey for limiting press freedom, restricting opposition voices, or reducing the independence of its courts. From the Turkish point of view, however, these criticisms sometimes feel like interference in their internal affairs. Turkish leaders often respond by saying that their country faces unique security challenges and must sometimes make tough decisions. This back and forth has caused diplomatic tension over the years.
Another sensitive area of disagreement has been U.S. policy in the Middle East. After the Cold War, America became more directly involved in the region, especially with interventions in Iraq, Afghanistan, and later its positions on Syria. Turkey, however, has its own ambitions and priorities as a regional power. For example, Turkey's leaders want to be seen as defenders of regional stability and as a voice for Muslim communities. Sometimes this ambition matches U.S. goals, but often it clashes. The Iraq War in 2003 is one major example. Turkey did not allow the U.S. to use its territory to launch a northern invasion, which created significant frustration in Washington.
And this brings us to another point of difference: Turkey's relationship with the European Union. The United States has historically supported Turkey's aspiration to join the EU, believing that such membership would anchor Turkey firmly within the Western democratic and economic community. However, tensions have emerged because the EU process has been slow, and at times, Turkey has faced rejection or hesitation from European countries. This situation has made Turkey feel both excluded and determined to follow its own independent path. From the US side, while Washington continues to back Turkey's Western integration, it also worries when Turkey looks eastward toward Russia, China, or other partners, instead of strengthening ties with Europe.
The theme of independence in Turkish foreign policy is very important. Over the last 2 decades, Turkey has tried to play a more autonomous role in the world. Its leaders argue that Turkey cannot always follow US or European preferences. Instead, they want Turkey to be recognized as a power in its own right, able to cooperate with the West, but also free to act with Russia, with Middle Eastern states, or with other global partners when it suits their interests. For the United States, this independence sometimes feels like a lack of loyalty, especially when Turkey buys weapons from Russia or makes deals that go against NATO consensus.
All these issues combined have placed significant strain on US-Turkey diplomatic relations. At times, leaders from both countries exchange sharp words, cancel visits, or recall ambassadors. Yet, at the same time, they recognize that they still need each other for security, trade, and regional stability. This is what makes the relationship so complex. It is not simply one of allies or enemies, but something in between. A partnership filled with both cooperation and competition, trust and mistrust, hope and frustration.
Dear listeners, as you can see, the story of US-Turkey relations is not straightforward. The political and diplomatic side reveals disagreements about values, about regional strategies, and about the direction of the future. This tension has not destroyed the relationship, but it has reshaped it many times. In the next section, we will continue our journey and examine how these tensions grew sharper in recent years, especially with conflicts in Syria, the fight against terrorism, and Turkey's unique role between East and West. We now come to one of the most sensitive and difficult issues in US-Turkey relations: the Kurdish question. The Kurds are an ethnic group who live across several countries, mainly in Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and Iran. They do not have an independent state, but they have their own language, culture, and identity. For many years, Kurdish communities have asked for more rights and recognition. In Turkey, this issue is especially important because millions of Kurds live in the southeast of the country.
During the Cold War, the Kurdish issue was mostly an internal matter for Turkey. The Turkish government wanted to keep strong control over its territory and prevent separatist movements. Over time, armed groups such as the PKK, or Kurdistan Workers' Party, began fighting against the Turkish state. The PKK has carried out attacks in Turkey for decades, and Ankara sees it as a terrorist organization. The United States and the European Union also officially list the PKK as a terrorist group, but disagreements appear when it comes to Kurdish groups in other countries.
The tensions became especially sharp during the fight against ISIS in the 2010s. When ISIS captured large areas of Iraq and Syria, the United States needed local partners on the ground to push them back. American forces decided to work with Kurdish militias in Syria and Iraq, such as the YPG in Syria and the Peshmerga in Iraq. These groups proved to be effective fighters and played a major role in defeating ISIS. From the U.S. perspective, the Kurdish fighters were brave allies who helped achieve a key security goal.
For Turkey, however, this was seen as a serious danger. Ankara argues that the YPG in Syria is directly connected to the PKK in Turkey. Turkish leaders fear that if the YPG grows stronger, it could encourage separatism inside Turkey or create an armed Kurdish region on Turkey's border. This is why, while the US saw Kurdish groups as partners, Turkey viewed them as threats. This fundamental difference has created deep mistrust between the two NATO allies, because their definitions of friend and enemy are not the same.
This mistrust has shaped almost every recent discussion between Washington and Ankara. Turkey has carried out military operations in northern Syria to push back Kurdish forces, while at the same time, U.S. troops have continued to support some Kurdish partners in the fight against ISIS. These overlapping policies create constant tension because Turkey believes its allies should never support groups connected to what it sees as terrorism. Meanwhile, the U.S. insists that these Kurdish fighters are necessary for stability in Syria.
The Kurdish question also influences NATO discussions. Within the alliance, members are supposed to trust one another's security concerns. But in practice, Turkey feels that its worries about Kurdish groups are not taken seriously by all of its partners. This has made Ankara more defensive and more willing to act alone. For the United States, the challenge is balancing its security strategy in the Middle East with the need to keep Turkey on its side. The result is a relationship filled with suspicion and constant debate.
Dear listeners, as you can see, the Kurdish issue is not a small disagreement. It is a central source of tension that affects how the United States and Turkey view each other. For the U.S., Kurdish partnerships bring short-term military success. For Turkey, the same partnerships look like a long-term threat to national unity. This difference creates frustration on both sides, and it continues to shape the future of their alliance. As we move deeper into the story of U.S.-Turkey relations, we must now discuss one of the most dramatic and controversial issues of recent years, the dispute over Turkey's purchase of the Russian S-400 missile defense system. This episode shows us how alliances can be tested, how national choices can create friction, and how questions of security and technology can affect not just two countries, but the entire NATO alliance. It is a story that mixes politics, military modernization, and strategic independence.
To understand why this decision was so important, let us start with what the S-400 system is. The S-400 is a modern air defense system designed and produced by Russia. It can track and target aircraft, drones, and missiles at long distances, making it one of the most advanced systems in the world. For Turkey, having such a system meant better protection of its skies and greater military strength. But for the United States, the choice of buying a Russian system raised alarm because it introduced non-NATO technology into the alliance's defense structure.
The U.S. concern was not only political, but also technological. NATO members usually purchase weapons and systems that are compatible with one another. This ensures that communication, radar systems, and defense strategies can work together smoothly. When Turkey chose the S-400, Washington feared that sensitive technology, especially information about the advanced American F-35 fighter jet, could be compromised. The fear was that Russian engineers might gain access to data about NATO aircraft, reducing their effectiveness.
The response from Washington was strong. The United States warned Turkey repeatedly that buying the S-400 would bring consequences. When Ankara went ahead with the purchase in 2019, the US government decided to impose sanctions under the Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act. Even more significantly, Turkey was removed from the F-35 program, a project in which it had invested heavily. For Turkey, this was a painful loss because it had planned to both buy the F-35 jets and help produce parts for them.
From the Turkish perspective, however, the story looks different. Turkish leaders argued that they had tried for many years to buy advanced air defense systems from Western partners, but those requests were either delayed or denied. They felt that when they turned to Russia, it was out of necessity, not preference. Ankara also insisted that buying the S-400 was an expression of sovereignty and strategic independence. In other words, Turkey was saying to its allies, "We will decide our own security needs, even if you do not approve."
This clash reveals something deeper about the relationship. For the United States, loyalty to NATO rules and technology standards is central to trust. For Turkey, being treated as an equal partner with freedom to choose is just as important. The S-400 issue brought these different perspectives into direct conflict. Washington saw a threat to alliance unity, while Ankara saw an unfair limitation on its independence. The result was not only sanctions, but also a feeling of mistrust that lingers even today.
Beyond the immediate consequences, the S-400 dispute also raises larger questions for NATO as a whole. If one member state can bring in advanced weapons from outside the alliance, does that weaken NATO's unity? Can partners trust each other if their systems are not fully compatible? Or does it mean that NATO must become more flexible, allowing members to follow their own paths while still cooperating on shared defense? These questions are not only about Turkey, but about the future of NATO in a changing world.
At the same time, the S-400 purchase reflects Turkey's broader goal of military modernization. Ankara has been working to strengthen its defense industry and reduce reliance on foreign suppliers. Turkey has invested in producing drones, warships, and even its own fighter jet projects. This ambition shows that Turkey wants to be more than just a consumer of Western weapons. It wants to be a producer and exporter of its own advanced systems. The S-400, while controversial, fits into this vision of greater self-reliance.
For the United States and its allies, the challenge is balancing two realities. On the one hand, Turkey is a NATO ally that contributes significantly to regional defense and stability. On the other hand, its actions, such as the S-400 purchase, create risks for NATO's security architecture. Managing this balance requires constant dialogue, careful diplomacy, and sometimes difficult compromises. The S-400 dispute may not have destroyed the alliance, but it has certainly reshaped it in ways that will be felt for many years to come.
Dear listeners, the S-400 episode is more than just a story about a weapons system. It is about trust, independence, and the struggle to balance national interests with alliance commitments. It reminds us that international relations are not simple. They are full of choices that bring both opportunity and risk. In our next section, we will continue by exploring how these disputes connect to regional conflicts, especially in Syria, and how the fight against terrorism has tested the fragile partnership between Washington and Ankara.
Dear listeners, up to this point we have spoken about military, political, and security tensions between the United States and Turkey. But another very important dimension of their relationship is economics. Trade, investment, energy, and sanctions all play a key role in shaping how these two countries interact. Sometimes economics acts as a bridge that keeps cooperation alive, and sometimes it becomes a weapon that increases rivalry. To understand U.S.-Turkey relations fully, we must also look carefully at this economic layer.
Trade relations between the United States and Turkey have grown over the years, but they have never reached their full potential. The two countries exchange goods such as machinery, aircraft parts, chemicals, and agricultural products. American companies have invested in Turkey in areas like technology, finance, and energy. At the same time, Turkish businesses see the US as an important market for textiles, food products, and industrial goods. Leaders from both sides often say that trade is one of the more positive aspects of their relationship.
Military sales have also been a central part of economic ties. For decades, Turkey purchased American weapons and defense systems, from fighter jets to helicopters and armored vehicles. These sales not only brought revenue to U.S. companies, but also connected Turkey more deeply to NATO standards. However, disputes like the S-400 purchase led to Turkey being removed from the F-35 program, which damaged both defense cooperation and economic partnership. What was once a profitable area of trade turned into a source of tension.
Another area where economics and strategy meet is energy. Turkey is not rich in oil and gas, but it is located in a critical position between producers in the Middle East and consumers in Europe. This makes Turkey a natural energy hub. American companies have invested in energy projects, and US policy often supports Turkey's role as a transit country. But Turkey has also looked to Russia for natural gas and even nuclear energy cooperation, which adds another layer of complexity to the relationship.
Sanctions have been one of the sharpest tools used by Washington. After Turkey bought the Russian S-400 system, the United States imposed economic sanctions on Turkish defense officials and institutions. Earlier disputes, such as the detention of an American pastor in Turkey, also led to financial penalties and currency instability. These examples show how quickly economic pressure can be used as a political weapon. For Turkey, such measures create frustration and push its leaders to seek new partnerships.
And this brings us to Turkey's search for alternatives. In recent years, Ankara has expanded its trade and investment ties with countries like Russia and China. These relationships are not only about economics, but also about reducing dependence on the West. Turkey has purchased energy from Russia, welcomed Chinese investments in infrastructure, and even explored using local currencies in trade. For the United States, these moves raise concern that Turkey may drift away from its Western economic partners.
When we step back, we can see that economics is more than just numbers or trade deals. It is deeply tied to politics, security, and strategy. The U.S.-Turkey relationship shows how economic cooperation can build bridges, but also how sanctions, competition, and rival partnerships can create divides. Trade, military sales, and energy links all matter, but behind them lies the bigger question: are the United States and Turkey economic partners, or are they drifting towards strategic rivalry?
Dear listeners, the economic dimension reminds us that alliances are not built only on security and diplomacy. They also depend on trade flows, financial trust, and mutual benefits. When economics works smoothly, it can support partnership. When it becomes a battlefield, it can deepen mistrust. In the next section, we will explore how regional conflicts, especially in Syria and the wider Middle East, have further shaped this uneasy balance between cooperation and rivalry.
Dear listeners, as we move closer to the end of our discussion, it is important to look at where the U.S.-Turkey relationship stands today, especially within NATO and in connection to regional conflicts. Turkey continues to be one of NATO's largest and most strategically located members. Its military is the second largest in the alliance after the United States, and its geography places it near Europe, the Middle East, and the Black Sea. This makes Turkey's role critical for NATO operations.
In practical terms, Turkey has contributed to many NATO missions. From Afghanistan to the Balkans, Turkish troops have participated in peacekeeping and stabilization efforts. Turkey also provides bases that allow NATO and US forces to operate in the region, most famously in Sirlik Air Base. This cooperation shows that despite political tensions, Turkey remains essential to alliance operations. NATO cannot ignore Turkey's role, even when disagreements run deep.
But regional conflicts continue to test this cooperation. Syria has been one of the sharpest points of friction. While the United States supported Kurdish groups against ISIS, Turkey viewed those groups as linked to the PKK and therefore dangerous. At the same time, Turkey has intervened militarily in northern Syria, sometimes without coordination with Washington. These actions create mistrust, but they also show that Turkey is determined to act independently when it believes its security is threatened.
Another conflict zone has been the Eastern Mediterranean. Disputes over maritime borders, energy exploration, and relations with Greece and Cyprus have placed Turkey in opposition to some NATO members. The United States often tries to balance support for its Greek ally with maintaining ties to Turkey. This creates a difficult balancing act within NATO, where allies are supposed to defend one another, not dispute territory and resources. Such tensions highlight the internal challenges NATO faces in keeping unity.
Beyond these immediate conflicts, the question is how NATO can keep Turkey engaged for the future. Some alliance members are worried that Ankara's independent moves, such as buying Russian weapons or building closer ties with non-Western powers, may weaken NATO's cohesion. At the same time, NATO leaders know that without Turkey, the alliance would lose a vital bridge between Europe and the Middle East. This means NATO must find ways to accommodate Turkey's independence while maintaining shared defense commitments.
When we look ahead, there are two possible futures. One is closer alignment, where the United States and Turkey manage their disagreements, rebuild trust, and cooperate more closely on regional security. This would require compromises on both sides, especially regarding the Kurdish issue, arms purchases, and democratic values. The other possible future is deeper rivalry, where mistrust grows, and Turkey looks more toward Russia, China, or regional alliances. This would create long-term difficulties for NATO's unity.
Dear listeners, the story of U.S.-Turkey relations inside NATO is not finished. It is a story still being written, shaped by regional conflicts, strategic interests, and political choices. What is clear is that Turkey remains both an essential ally and a difficult partner. The future will depend on whether cooperation outweighs rivalry and whether trust can be rebuilt. In our final section, we will summarize the key lessons for learners and reflect on what this case teaches us about international relations and alliances. When we study alliances like that of the United States and Turkey, it's not just about governments, military bases, or trade deals. Public opinion also plays a very big role. In both countries, people's views of each other have shifted many times over the years. During the early Cold War, many Turks viewed the U.S. as a protector against the Soviet Union. American leaders also often spoke of Turkey as a strong friend. But as conflicts and disagreements grew, public trust on both sides became weaker.
Surveys in Turkey today often show that large groups of people are suspicious of U.S. policies in the Middle East. Many Turks believe that Washington sometimes ignores Ankara's security concerns, especially when it comes to Kurdish groups or regional conflicts. In the United States, meanwhile, public attention toward Turkey has been less consistent. Americans may hear about Turkey mainly when big disputes happen, such as over the S-400 missile system or tensions in Syria, shaping a sometimes negative image.
Cultural exchange has also been important in keeping connections alive despite these tensions. Thousands of Turkish students have studied in American universities, and many Americans travel to Turkey for tourism, business, or cultural reasons. This has helped build human-to-human ties, which can often soften political disagreements. Turkey's unique cultural identity, being both European and Middle Eastern, fascinates many Americans. Similarly, Turkish audiences often consume American movies, music, and technology, showing the depth of soft power influence.
But at the same time, nationalist politics in both countries have sometimes fueled mistrust. Turkish politicians may criticize the U.S. to win domestic support, and American leaders may speak against Turkey when explaining NATO challenges. These political messages can shape how citizens feel. That is why sometimes polls show a very low level of trust, even though the two nations are still military allies. It demonstrates that public opinion does not always match official policy, but still matters greatly.
For NATO, this cultural and public dimension is important because alliances are not only about military strength, they are also about shared trust, values, and perceptions. If citizens in one country feel the other is more rival than ally, then even cooperation at the government level becomes more difficult. In the U.S.-Turkey case, this is one of the big challenges for the future. If public opinion remains divided, leaders may find it harder to repair trust, no matter what strategies they choose.
For English learners, this section highlights some important new vocabulary. Words like perception, the way people see or think about something; nationalist, a person or movement focused on national pride and independence; and soft power, influence through culture, education, and values rather than military force, are useful when reading about global politics. They remind us that international relations are shaped not only by armies and leaders, but also by how ordinary people view each other.
Dear listeners, we have now reached the conclusion of today's journey on the English globe. We began by asking an important question: are the United States and Turkey true NATO allies, or are they strategic rivals? Along the way, we explored their shared history, their cooperation, and also their disagreements. What we have learned is that the relationship cannot be reduced to a simple label. It is filled with both cooperation and conflict, trust and suspicion, partnership and competition.
If we look back, the key points become clear. First, Turkey's entry into NATO during the Cold War made it a frontline ally of the United States. Second, their military cooperation, especially with bases and defense systems, gave NATO a strong advantage. Third, the end of the Cold War created new tensions, from disagreements in Iraq to Syria, and from human rights to independent foreign policy. The S-400 dispute, Kurdish question, and economic rivalries have all added layers of complexity to this relationship.
This story shows us a powerful lesson about international relations. Alliances are not always smooth. Even allies can disagree sharply, because every country has its own interests, goals, and security concerns. Sometimes cooperation is strong, but at other times, mistrust grows. The US and Turkey remind us that alliances must constantly adapt to survive, and that balance between unity and independence is never easy. This lesson applies not only to countries, but also to relationships in our daily lives.
As English learners, we can also take something special from today's discussion. Notice how certain words keep coming up. Words like ally, rival, cooperation, security, sanctions, and strategy. These are important vocabulary items for anyone studying global affairs. By practicing these words, repeating them in sentences, and noticing how they are used in real discussions, learners can strengthen both their vocabulary and their understanding of world politics.
Another useful point is how language changes with context. For example, when we say ally, it usually means a partner, but in international politics, an ally can also be a competitor in some areas. When we say rival, it does not always mean enemy. It can mean a partner with competing goals. These subtle meanings are what make English both rich and challenging. Listening to global affairs podcasts like this one helps you notice these details in real examples.
The final takeaway is clear. The United States and Turkey remain partners in NATO, but they have competing strategies and interests. They still need each other for defense, regional stability, and cooperation. At the same time, their disagreements over the Kurds, over Russian weapons, over democracy and foreign policy will continue to shape their future. The relationship is not black and white. It is a mix of cooperation and rivalry, and that is what makes it so fascinating to study.
Dear listeners, thank you for staying with us through this long and important discussion. We hope you not only learned about the US-Turkey relationship, but also expanded your English vocabulary, improved your listening, and deepened your understanding of global affairs. Please remember to like this episode, subscribe to the English Globe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Which part of today's story did you find most interesting? Do you think Turkey and the US will stay strong allies or become rivals?
We look forward to reading your opinions. Your participation helps us make better podcasts and build a community of learners who are curious, engaged, and motivated. Remember, learning English is not only about grammar and vocabulary. It is also about using the language to understand the world, to think critically, and to express your own ideas. That is what we try to do here together. Thank you for listening, and until next time, keep learning, keep practicing, and keep exploring.